Welcome to the Phases of Ediculture introductory video recorded at the winter solstice of 2018 with me, Stephen. This video is an introductory video to some online courses that I'm running about ediculture and the phases of ediculture, which, as you will see from this video, is a whole host of different subjects that I've been studying for the last 15 years, accumulating knowledge about growing my own food, growing my own medicine, foraging for food, working with permacultural design techniques, working in many gardens with many volunteers for about the last 15 years. And this is an opportunity for you to learn more about this and come and share with a group of people in an informal way, ways that you can empower yourself through plants. So I really wish to share what I have to offer with you this winter in the darker half of the year, when there's not much to do in the gardens, and we wish to join with others and drink cups of tea and have a fun time together and chat about what we might wish to do for the coming year. So let's begin. What is ediculture? Well, for me, ediculture is just a short form of expressing edible culture in a very broad sense. All the ways that we relate to food, so we can essentially call it food culture as well. And to give you a context for it, we have horticulture, which is garden culture. We have agriculture, which is agrarian culture, which refers to crops. And we have permaculture, which refers to permanent culture. We have silviculture, which is tree culture. Apiculture is bee culture. So it's what we're really trying to share with you here is another aspect of looking at culture, and it's the culture around food. And it's a very broad subject, and the way that I got introduced to it was really by having health problems and realizing that by focusing on what I ate and what I consumed, it was a very easy way to get to understand my body and make me feel more alive, more healthy, more happy, more connected to life. And so let's have a look a bit about where this word came from for me. So for me, ediculture began growing up in Sheffield and having done my allotment for about at least 3 years after finishing school and essentially dropping out of education for a while to address a sense of direction, sense of purpose. I met up with a guy called Richard Clare, who had dedicated his life to teaching people about food growing and food culture, and in particular working with plants and working on allotments and educating people in the urban organic food growing side of things. And he set up a charity in 1998 called the Sheffield Organic Food Initiative. And the Sheffield Organic Food Initiative, also known as SOFI, was a network of individuals who were focused on bringing organic food to the wider city and getting as many people engaged with it as possible, with the intention of alleviating poverty, increasing health, and building food security as well. And Sheffield had a history of allotments going back at least 100 years. And back in the 80s there was hundreds of allotments that were abandoned. So this group of like-minded people back in the 80s and 90s, who came to set up the Sheffield Organic Food Initiative as supporters of Richard, they recognised that this was something that was kind of being neglected by society at large, and also saw that it had huge benefits to the wider world, which I'm sure many of you can understand. It was really an immediate, direct way of not only re-engaging with nature, but also a way of empowering yourself to shift from being a consumer to being a producer, with very little need for infrastructure or investment. And for those people who persevered with this ideal, they found that many of them got jobs out of it, in either going on to being market gardeners, or becoming educators around nutrition, or maybe running social and therapeutic horticulture projects. So many of these things have come to the forefront now in our understanding, and for me, I came into this picture in 2002 and studied with Richard Clare for at least one day a week for about 5 years, going up to the allotments. And here you can see a picture of the allotments with Richard running a seed saving demonstration and workshop for half a dozen volunteers. And we were kind of being introduced to hundreds of different varieties of plants, and for me, I was pretty much getting half my own food by within 5 years of me starting to grow, and experiencing numerous benefits from this, and really wanting to share all these benefits with others. So what we began to create was a series of courses that followed the wheel of the year, because it was very evident from my learning that there were indications from the different seasons that people could act, indications for action, and I really wanted to get people to engage with plants on a practical level. So this series of courses is what has essentially evolved into becoming the Ediculture course for me. And let's just take a step into what this world means. If I was to summarize what Richard was really trying to express, the core action of Ediculture to the rest of the world, it could be summarized in a kind of cryptic metaphor, which was we need to put circles into squares. And for me, this began a line of thinking that made me realize that we've been brought up in a very square framework of thinking, and nature, represented by the circle, is a way of bringing in this element to our way of life. And so we're fusing the organic principle, which we can call nature, with a kind of human principle, which is our structure and order, and our society as well. So let's take a step into that. So this is a typical calendar which we all get introduced to from a very early age, and we kind of see the months go by, and at the end of the year we go back to January again and we start a new year, and time moves on like this. And for most of us this is kind of a normal way of seeing time, but for those of you who've engaged in growing things, or even for those of you who've just been observant of the seasons, you realize that time doesn't really move like this, and these months are mostly arbitrary, and it's quite impossible for time to suddenly take a giant leap from December to January and say, oh, it's now a new year, we start it all again. And if we look at many different cultures, we'll find that some cultures start their year in February. The ancient Greeks started their beginning of their year on the first new moon after summer solstice, which would often be in July. And the ancient Celts, some people would argue, started their year at the beginning of November. So the question arises, when is the right time to do something? When is the right time to plant our seeds, for example, or to harvest what we've planted, or to prepare to grow something, or maybe even rest from our activities in nature? Well, let's begin by reframing our time and addressing a circular pattern for the year, and to really mirror this cycle and realize that there's no beginning and end to the year, that there is simply time moving around. And if we imagine a plant taking 3 months to grow, we can imagine it covering roughly a quarter of the circle. Or if it's 6 months, it's half the circle, or if it's 9 months, it's 3/4 of the circle, and if it's 12 months, it's a whole year. And so for plants, this is much more close to how they might see things, and this is the kind of entry point for us engaging in ediculture. And so to take this a step further, what we're really talking about is the solar year. And in this diagram here, we mark the axis of the year, which is reminding ourselves that there's a point where the sun stands still, and this point occurs twice a year at midsummer and midwinter. And there's a point when the daylight lengths are equal both at the spring equinox and at the autumn equinox, with one equinox in the spring marking the movement into the lighter half of the year, and at autumn equinox the movement into the darker half of the year. So this is the basis of understanding the ediculture framework, from which every other subject on it can be hung. And let's take it a step further and pinpoint what happens at the midpoints between these solar markers of midsummer, midwinter, spring equinox and autumn equinox. So if we were a plant, provided we had the soil and the water, the other major factor to our growth would be the warmth levels, and in particular the warmth of the soil. So as the sun kind of rises a little bit higher in the sky from midwinter, where we are now as I give this talk, it takes time for the soil to begin to warm up, and usually that's a 6-week process. We can estimate it as about 6 weeks, depending upon our location to the oceans primarily, and how much rainfall we get. Just as the way the sea is often very cold in the spring and quite warm in the autumn, and when you put a hot flame on a kettle, it takes time for that heat to enter into the water and to be stored. The earth is exactly the same, and the plants behave in relation to the warmth of the earth. So we've got these quarter points marked, or midpoints we can say, between the major solar markers, where in the bottom left of the chart we've got the wording "warming begins." So we can imagine that the soil begins to warm up about 6 weeks after midwinter, and likewise 6 weeks after spring equinox we have a transition point into the warmer half of the year. We've already entered the lighter half of the year, but now we're entering the warmer half of the year, and we can see this vividly in nature, that many plants start flowering and growing rapidly, not when it gets to the lighter half of the year, but when it gets to the warmer half of the year. And this is the real spring rush. And likewise in the autumn, 6 weeks after midsummer, the cooling begins, but it's actually the point at which the soil is often the warmest, because it's stored all that summer heat. And then the cooling cycle takes us through to the lower right half of this chart, to a transition point again into the cooler half of the year. So as far as our mirroring nature is concerned, we really want to begin to perceive the lowest quadrant and the quadrant on the left as the winter, and the upper quadrant and the quadrant on the right as the summer, with the transition points being the top left and the bottom right. And so back in 2009 I drew this diagram as an indication for action that I mentioned earlier, of kind of key things that you can engage with when working with plants, which is my primary way of engaging in ediculture, but not solely. And this was based on an accumulation of many years of seeing how people struggled to know when to do things and wanted a bit of a guide. So it was a guide to rethink calendars and to give them some indications for action. And you can see around the edge of this chart, without going into too much detail, that the solstices are marked and the equinoxes are marked, just as the previous chart. And at the quarter points, or midpoints between the solar indicators, we have Imbolc in the bottom left, we have Beltane in the top left, we have Lammas in the top right, and Samhain or Samhain at the bottom right. And these are what we refer to as the fire festivals. And these fire festivals are the key times when we have to pay attention to what's going on in nature regarding plants. These are the points when we really see the changes of the seasons kick in. And in a way, I would like to say that these are the true midwinters and equinoxes when it comes to our engagement with nature. So this is what the ancient Celts were really referring to, and they referred to it as the wheel of the year, and it had an 8-spoke pattern to it. And we've kind of lost touch with this. So what we're going to do in ediculture is to reattune ourselves to this pattern and to see what indications for action we can do for our health in regards growing food primarily at these times of the year. And as I started to look deeper into it, it started to see that there was the ediculture framework, which became what I'm teaching in the course as the Phases of Ediculture, fell very naturally into 8 subjects, which I'll introduce to you shortly. So this isn't a new idea. This idea of seeing an eightfold wheel of the year, or even within a day, we could say there's a similar eightfold pattern, is universal across many cultures. This is what's referred to as the Bagua. This is from the ancient Taoist tradition in China, and they had exactly the same idea of expressing the cycles of the seasons through 8 archetypes, as you can see around the edge. And just as we have a lighter half of the year and a darker half of the year, so they represented this in the yin and the yang, and the beginnings of one energy followed by beginnings of another energy at the solstice points at the top and the bottom of the yin and yang symbol, as you can see. And also, bringing it more up to date, there is an organisation who I give a lot of credit to for helping me understand Ediculture in this eightfold pattern, and this is an organisation called the 8 Shields, and this is their 8-wheel framework, which they also work around the wheel of the year, which they refer to as the 8 attributes of connection, and that each point of the year refers to well, it's not even the year, it's like a kind of learning cycle that they see of as being a natural learning cycle that goes through 8 stages, referring to the directions, the times of the day, the wheel of the year. And these are kind of cyclical patterns that are built into us from millions of years of living within nature itself. So Ediculture also sits within such a framework. And so when I came to think about how all the subjects of Ediculture fitted within this framework, this is what I came up with. And this has evolved probably for the last 8 years into this rough framework, where we can see in the east, in the left of the chart, we have foraging. It's a very natural time to go out in the spring and start to want to pick things again, and all those fresh greens coming up are really great for waking us up, getting our body moving, clearing out the toxins that have accumulated in winter, just making us feel more alive and in that spring spirit. And from looking for our own food, we move to growing our own food, which kicks in at Beltane, or we could say the top left of the chart, where the word warming is. And the key relationships of this time are growing, and growing really being, well, if we can't find it, let's grow it, and being very rooted in wanting to put seeds in the ground and engage in the annual cycle that kicks off, especially at this time of year. And then in the south, at the top of the chart, which is also another representation of midsummer from our previous slides, we have designing our growing systems, which is, or as a typo there, it should say 3, designing growing systems. And this is where we look at placing. It's where we look at topography, we look at landscape, we look at microclimates, we look at how we can really hone our growing techniques and see them in a bigger context. And then in the top right of the chart, I've given the title of the 4th session as Seasonality, which is the energy of rooting. And as you may remember from previous diagrams, this is a time when the soil temperature is really kind of at its peak. It's accumulated all that summer sun, and plants really love to grow at this time, provided that there's the water for them. And seasonality is also the beginning of our descent into the darker half of the year. We start to notice the light levels changing at this time, and it makes us think about timing. There's a natural withdrawing a little bit and thinking about when is the right time to pick what we've planted. When is the right time to harvest? Is this fruit ready yet? Are the questions that go through our mind. So really we need to start looking at not just what we do, but when we do it. And this this southwest phase is going to focus on that. That'll be the 4th session. And then in the west we have the 5th session, which is nutrition. And this again continues our journey into harvest. We want to eat what we've grown, and we want to get the best out of what we've grown, so that whether we're cooking it or eating it raw or juicing it or processing it in whatever way, we want to know how can we get the most out of it, how can we feed our bodies the best at this time of year. And also within this nourishing time there's also a natural sense of sharing what we've grown, and not just nourishing ourselves on a personal level, but also within our communities. How can we nourish our soul and share what we've brought to the table? And then in the northwest we have cooling. This is the time of Samhain. This is the time when we enter the cooler half of the year, and this subject at this time of year for Ediculture is Herbalism. So again, continuing the journey into our bodies, beginning with timing and nutrition. We really want to start to understand the deeper qualities of plants, how we can medicate ourselves, how we can find those roots in the ground that will boost our immune systems to get us through the hardest time of the year that's coming, which is the winter. And so in the north we have working with others, and this is the final phase of what I call the yin cycle, or the inward cycle of Ediculture, which is we really have to figure out a way of sharing our gifts with other people, whatever it is we've learnt, and to harvest the stories of others, and to have others harvest the stories of us, so that we can increase the circle of our relationship with plants and find people who can affirm or criticize or develop us further. And also to share in a group, not only eating but also understanding around these things, because this subject of Ediculture is very much what I refer to as local specific, meaning it's impossible to write it in a book. The information that you might need where you are will be different from the information someone else might need in a new environment or a different environment. So you really, we really need to figure out a way of sharing the specific stories to our place and time that will help others to also relate to their environment, which we are sharing with them on the same level. And so this time refers to communication. And following on from this session, which is really nothing to do with food, it's all to do with how we communicate and relate to others in a harmonious, loving way. This naturally follows on to the northeast, which is the dreaming time, and it would be referred to as the time just before dawn. And within this time, the final session of Ediculture looks at nature connection, and I should have really in a way put nature with a capital N there. we're looking at nature connection from a broad sense, in an organic way. We are nature, and this really is the subject that encompasses the entire cycle, because all of it is nature connection. And if you can really go deep into this nature connection, the whole cycle, the next time you come around, will be stronger and faster and deeper for you. This nature connection for me came about through really studying the teachings of the Eight Shields network that I mentioned earlier, and a lot of it will be looking into bird language and learning how to just sit and observe what's going on in our environment without wanting to take anything, without the sense of needing to give anything or do anything. Simple observation of what is happening in our environment. And from this, the spring comes again, and the greens start growing, and we want to go and pick some new things and move back into that joyous energy of spring. So this is the 8 phases of Ediculture, and as I mentioned, they relate to the Wheel of the Year. This is a framework which you can take to your own understanding. You can fit your own understanding within it. You can use it in whichever way you like. For me, it's become the way of framing my understanding and giving me a tool to share with others in a very easy, understandable way. And that each one of these aspects of Ediculture can be expanded upon, and also goes through this very same learning cycle within each subject. So it's kind of, in a way, you can see it zooming infinitely in and also zooming infinitely out. Just as time does, we can look at a second as being, a very long period of time, but also 1,000 years as being a very short period of time. So that's really the end of this introductory video, and now I would just like to promote the courses again, which will look at these 8 phases of Ediculture, and go into a lot more detail as to what I've learned from them, accumulated from Richard Clare, accumulated from my own understandings of working in gardens for the last 15 to 20 years. So the 7th of January is the first course from 7 till 9, and it will be 8 weeks following on every Wednesday. That's a Monday at Coyd Hills Rural Arts Space in the Vale of Glamorgan, and then on Wednesday the 9th of January 7 till 9 p.m. at Milky's Cafe in Cardiff, for those of you who are in the city. You can also, if you wish, get this information, this training in Ediculture online. You'll get all the coursework and lectures emailed to you, and I can also offer email support. And in terms of the cost of the course, I'm running it as a flexible course depending upon what you earn, and really it's just a matter of getting in touch to find out what it will cost you. I'm running this course on a non-profit basis essentially, but I need to cover my costs, so that's the idea there. And if you want to sign up immediately to the course, you can email me at ediculture@gmail.com or phone me on 07507 57885. So that's it from me, Stephen. I hope you've enjoyed listening, and maybe see you soon. I'd love to meet you if you do wish to come, and look forward to hearing from you. Bye bye.